Mobile, Alabama, April 14th, 1857. The afternoon heat pressed down on Water Street like a wool blanket soaked in Gulf humidity, turning the air thick enough to taste. Dogs sought shade beneath merchant carts, and even the dock workers who normally shouted crude jokes across the wharves had fallen into sullen silence. By 3 o'clock, respectable people had retreated indoors, leaving the streets to sailors, slaves running errands, and the occasional drunk stumbling between grog shops. The kind of heat that made people careless, that dulled attention and made witnesses unreliable, which was exactly why Eleanor Fairmont had chosen this day. Jeremiah Whitmore's photography wagon sat in an alley behind McKinley's Mercantile, positioned where the narrow passage dead-ended against a brick warehouse wall. The wagon itself was unremarkable, a converted Conestoga with J. Whitmore daguerreotype portraits, two, painted in yellow letters that had faded to the color of old butter. Whitmore had arrived in Mobile 3 weeks earlier, setting up his traveling studio in a location carefully chosen for discretion. Unlike the portrait studios on Government Street, where wealthy families posed in their finest clothes beneath crystal skylights, Whitmore's wagon catered to working people, sailors wanting a photograph to send home before shipping out, young couples marrying in haste and needing proof for distant families, freedmen scraping together coins to document their existence in a world that preferred to forget they existed. Business had been steady enough that no one paid attention to his comings and goings, until the night a white woman knocked on his wagon door after midnight. Whitmore had been developing plates in his makeshift darkroom, using the red-filtered lantern that turned everything the color of dried blood. The knock came soft, almost apologetic, but insistent. 3 raps, pause, 3 more. When he opened the door a crack, he found himself looking at a young woman whose face he recognized immediately from the society pages of the Mobile Register. Eleanor Fairmont, 22 years old, daughter of Henry Fairmont, who owned Riverside, Magnolia Heights, and Fairhaven, 3 cotton plantations that together employed 347 enslaved people and produced enough bales to fill 4 steamboats every harvest season. Standing 2 steps behind her in the shadows, hat pulled low and eyes fixed on the ground, was a black man Whitmore didn't know but instantly understood. "Mr. Whitmore," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the visible trembling in her hands. "We need a photograph taken. Tonight. I can pay you $50. She held out 5 $10 gold pieces that caught the moonlight like small suns. In 1857, $50 represented nearly 3 months' income for a traveling photographer. It also represented enough money to make a man ignore his instincts, which were screaming at him to close the door and pretend this conversation had never happened. Whitmore looked past her at the man in the shadows. "Who's he?" "His name is Samuel." She said it with a possessiveness that made Whitmore's throat tighten. "Not my father's property, or one of our people. Just his name, spoken like it mattered, like he was someone whose identity existed independent of his bondage." Whitmore knew immediately what they were asking. Interracial marriage had been illegal in Alabama since 1822, codified in a law that made it a crime for any white person to intermarry with a Negro or descendant of a Negro to the 3rd generation inclusive. The penalty was imprisonment, but everyone understood the real punishment would come from vigilantes long before any judge saw the case. And simply being photographed together, documented in a medium that captured reality with unsettling precision, violated social codes so fundamental that most white Southerners couldn't imagine anyone breaking them. Photographs weren't like paintings, which could be denied or explained away as artistic license. Photographs testified. They were evidence of things that had actually happened, frozen in silver and glass. "This is a dangerous thing you're asking," Whitmore said quietly. "I know." Eleanor's eyes met his directly, and he saw something in them that made him understand this wasn't impulsive rebellion or naive romance. This was desperation refined into steel. "That's why I'm paying you enough to leave town immediately after. I assume you'll want to." She wasn't wrong. Whitmore counted the coins in his palm, feeling their weight, calculating distances. $50 would get him to New Orleans by steamboat, with enough left over to rent a studio and start over with a new name. He'd done it before, in Charleston, after a different kind of trouble. He opened the wagon door wider. "Come in, both of you, quickly." The interior smelled like collodion and ether, chemicals sharp enough to make eyes water. Whitmore had converted the space into a functional portrait studio, with a canvas backdrop tacked to one wall and a wooden bench positioned to catch light from the oil lamps he arranged in careful angles. His camera, a Voigtlander brass lens mounted on a mahogany box, sat on its tripod like a mechanical eye that saw too much and judged nothing. Samuel entered last, removing his hat and holding it in both hands with the careful posture that suggested years of practice in avoiding attention. He was young, maybe 26, with the kind of bearing that came from walking a tightrope every day of your life. His clothes surprised Whitmore. Not the rough Osnaburg that field hands wore, but a white linen shirt, clean and starched, with buttons made of actual buttons rather than carved wood or bone. Someone had taken care with his appearance, someone who had access to the house, to the laundry, to the sewing materials that marked the difference between field labor and domestic work. "Where do you want us?" Eleanor asked, already moving toward the bench with the decisiveness of someone who had thought through every detail. Whitmore lit 4 oil lamps and arranged them in a semicircle, creating the diffuse light that would keep shadows from turning faces into masks. He loaded a prepared glass plate into the camera, his hands moving through the familiar ritual while his mind continued screaming at him to stop. "Sit on the bench," he said. "You can arrange yourselves however you want, but remember, you'll have to hold completely still for 15 seconds once I remove the lens cap. Even breathing too deeply will blur the image." Eleanor sat first, arranging her dark silk dress with the unconscious grace of someone trained from childhood in the mechanics of appearing respectable. Her dress was expensive, dark silk with ivory buttons running from collar to waist, but not ostentatious. The kind of dress a planter's daughter might wear for an informal afternoon visit, nothing that would draw attention in a family photograph. Samuel stood behind her, and for a moment Whitmore thought he would maintain the careful neutrality of a servant, hands at his sides, face blank. Instead, Samuel placed his right hand on Eleanor's shoulder. The gesture was subtle, almost innocent. In any other context, a brother with his sister, a husband with his wife, it would have meant nothing. But here, in this wagon that smelled of chemicals and secrets, with the weight of Alabama law and Southern custom pressing down on all 3 of them, it meant everything. Whitmore saw the way Samuel's fingers curved against the dark silk, not gripping but resting with a familiarity that spoke of countless similar moments. He saw Eleanor's hand reach up to cover Samuel's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. And he saw the way they looked at each other instead of at the camera, their faces turning slightly inward, creating a private world that excluded everything else. "That's how you want it?" Whitmore asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes." Whitmore ducked beneath the focusing cloth and stared at their inverted images in the ground glass. The composition was perfect in a way that made his chest ache. 2 people rendered in shades of gray, their bodies forming a single silhouette against the dark backdrop. Beautiful and damning in equal measure. He removed the ground glass, inserted the prepared plate, and withdrew the dark slide. "When I remove the lens cap, don't move. Don't even think about moving. 15 seconds. He removed the cap. The lens opened like a dilated pupil, and for 15 seconds that stretched into something eternal. Eleanor and Samuel held themselves absolutely still. The oil lamps hissed softly. Somewhere outside, a drunk sang a tuneless song about a girl in New Orleans. Inside the wagon, 2 people breathed as shallowly as possible, while a chemical reaction captured the light reflecting off their faces, their hands, the silk of Eleanor's dress, and the starched linen of Samuel's shirt, capturing everything, the angle of her chin, the way his thumb pressed against her shoulder, the undeniable evidence that they had sat together like this, touching, present, real. Whitmore replaced the lens cap and withdrew the plate. "Done. You can move now." Eleanor exhaled shakily. Samuel's hand slipped from her shoulder, and the absence seemed to pain them both. Whitmore carried the plate to his developing table, mixing the iron sulfate solution with fingers that had grown steady through years of practice. The developing solution always made him think of blood, the way it bloomed across the pale glass in reddish stains before the image emerged. He poured it carefully over the exposed plate, rocking it back and forth while watching shapes materialize out of chemical mist. First came the darkest shadows. The backdrop, Samuel's face turned slightly toward Eleanor. Then the mid-tones, Eleanor's dress, her hands folded in her lap, the graceful curve of her neck. Finally, the highlights, the buttons on his shirt, the way light caught her hair, the delicate bones of their intertwined fingers. The image sharpened with each second until Whitmore was looking at something so clear, so undeniable, that his hands started shaking despite his years of experience. He'd photographed hundreds of people, soldiers and merchants, mothers with babies, old men who wanted one last image before death. But he'd never captured this particular quality before. The photograph didn't just show two people sitting together. It showed intimacy, connection, the kind of bond that could survive in a world determined to destroy it or die trying. When the image had fixed in the solution, Whitmore washed the plate carefully and mounted it in a leather case, the expensive kind with velvet lining that protected daguerreotypes from scratches and air. He handed it to Eleanor without speaking. She opened the case and stared at the image for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears that she didn't let fall. "It's perfect," she whispered. Samuel looked at the photograph over her shoulder, and something in his expression broke in a way that made Whitmore turn away. This was private, this moment. He shouldn't be witnessing it. "You need to leave," he said quietly. "Separately. You first, ma'am." "Give her 10 minutes," he told Samuel. "Then go a different direction." Eleanor closed the leather case and tucked it inside her shawl, pressing it against her ribs like it was something alive that needed protection. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." "Don't thank me. Just leave town and don't come back. Whatever you're planning, it's going to end badly." He said it as gently as he could, but her expression didn't change. "I know," she said, "but at least we'll have proof that this was real." She left first, slipping out into the darkness with the careful movements of someone who had practiced being invisible. Samuel waited exactly 10 minutes, counted out on Whitmore's pocket watch, before following. He paused at the door, looked back at Whitmore, and said the only words he'd spoken all night. "Take care of yourself." Then he was gone, and Whitmore was alone with his wagon full of chemicals and the glass negative that still sat in the developing tray, the one piece of evidence that could connect him to what had just happened. He stared at it for almost a minute, weighing risks and possibilities, before making his decision. He carried the glass plate to his small stove and opened the door, watching flames lick at seasoned oak. The plate went in carefully, and he watched it crack from the heat, the image blackening and curling before finally shattering into pieces too small to recognize. He burned his developing notes next, then the cloth he'd used to wipe the excess solution. When he was finished, there was no evidence that Eleanor Fairmont and Samuel had ever been in his wagon. No evidence except the photograph itself, which was already miles away, hidden beneath layers of silk and secrecy. Whitmore didn't sleep that night. At dawn, he began packing his equipment, working with the methodical focus of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how long it took to erase a life. By noon, his wagon stood empty in the alley behind McKinley's Mercantile, stripped of everything except the canvas backdrop and the lingering smell of chemicals. His equipment was crated and loaded onto a freight wagon heading to the docks. His accounts at the boarding house were settled. The landlady accepted his excuse about a sick relative in Baton Rouge without question. His name was erased from the city directory at the register office, a favor granted by a clerk who accepted $2 without asking questions. By 3 o'clock, exactly 24 hours after Eleanor Fairmont had first knocked on his door, Jeremiah Whitmore was standing on the deck of the steamboat Magnolia Queen, watching Mobile's waterfront recede into the heat haze. He carried one trunk, $300 in various currencies, and a conscience that would never quite settle. 3 days later, he arrived in New Orleans and disappeared into the chaos of the French Quarter, adopting a new name and telling people he'd come from St. Louis. No one in Mobile ever saw him again. The photograph survived for 94 years after that night, passing through hands that didn't understand what they were holding. When Henry Fairmont's house burned in 1861, Set ablaze by retreating Confederate soldiers who'd heard rumors of Union sympathies, most of the family's possessions turned to ash and smoke. But Eleanor's Bible survived, pulled from the wreckage by a house slave named Martha, who remembered the young mistress with something more complicated than simple affection. The photograph was still tucked between the pages of Song of Solomon, pressed flat against verses about love that transgressed boundaries. Martha kept the Bible for 40 years, and when she died in 1901, it passed through estate sales and church fundraisers, changing hands 3 more times before landing in the Alabama Department of Archives in 1951. A curator bought it for $15 at a Saturday estate sale, cataloged it simply as unidentified portrait, mid-19th century, and stored it in a climate-controlled vault alongside thousands of other images from Alabama's past. Catalog number 1951 12.0847. Not lost, just unrecognized. Until March 2003, when graduate student Marcus Webb was researching interracial relationships in antebellum Alabama and decided to examine every photograph in the archive's unidentified collections. He spent 4 months going cross-eyed from staring at faded images under magnifying glasses. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, he opened catalog number 1951, 12.0847, and understood immediately that he was looking at something extraordinary. It wasn't just the composition or the obvious intimacy. It was Eleanor's face. The expression she wore was one Marcus had seen before in other photographs of white women from the period, but never directed at a black man. Love. Unguarded, undeniable, preserved in silver with a clarity that made his hands shake. He cross-referenced everything. The clothing dated to 1856-1858. The technique matched daguerreotype portraiture of that specific period. And there, embossed so faintly in the corner of the leather case that 3 previous archivists had missed it, was a signature. J. Whitmore, Traveling Portraits. Marcus spent the next 3 months tracking down every reference to J. Whitmore he could find in Mobile's newspapers from 1857. The photographer had advertised his services from March 23rd through April 17th. Then nothing. His advertisement stopped, his boarding house room was found abandoned, and a brief notice appeared on April 21st, noting that the photographer J. Whitmore has departed the city, leaving debts unpaid. Marcus kept digging. He found Eleanor's name in society columns, Henry Fairmont's name in business transactions and court records. He built a timeline of the family's movements, their social connections, the architecture of their lives. Then, in the July 23rd, 1857 edition of the Mobile Register, he found what he'd been dreading. The headline ran across 3 columns: Planter found dead, foul play suspected. Henry Fairmont, discovered in his study at Magnolia Heights Plantation on the morning of July 19th. Cause of death, poisoning. Primary suspects, his daughter Eleanor and the Negro Samuel, property of the deceased. Both had vanished the night before Fairmont's death. A reward of $500 was offered for their capture. Marcus sat in the archive's reading room, holding a newspaper that was 146 years old, and felt his dissertation shift from academic inquiry into something else entirely. This wasn't just a photograph of forbidden love. It was evidence in a murder case that ended with a double execution. Magnolia Heights Plantation, Baldwin County, Alabama, 3 months earlier, January 11th, 1857. The conservatory at Magnolia Heights was Henry Fairmont's pride, a glass-walled room where tropical plants imported from Cuba grew in defiance of Alabama's winter. Orchids bloomed in hanging baskets, their heavy perfume mixing with the smell of damp earth and coal smoke from the heating pipes that snaked beneath the tile floor. It was here, surrounded by plants that had no business surviving this far north, that Eleanor Fairmont first told Samuel they were going to kill her father. "He knows," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood with her back to him, staring at a bird of paradise that had finally bloomed after 3 years of stubborn refusal. The morning light filtered through condensation-covered glass, turning everything soft and unreal. He's known for weeks, maybe longer. Samuel stood near the door, his posture rigid despite being alone with her. 5 years of secret meetings had taught him that safety was an illusion, that discovery could come at any moment through a servant's loose tongue or a neighbor's suspicious glance. His reflection in the glass wall showed a man who had learned to hide everything: fear, anger, hope, love, behind a mask of careful neutrality. "How do you know?" His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the pruning shears he'd been using too tightly, knuckles turning pale against dark skin. "Martha heard him talking to Judge Crawford yesterday. Crawford suggested sending me to my aunt in Virginia until the matter resolves itself. Father said that wouldn't be necessary, that he would handle it personally." Eleanor turned to face him, and Samuel saw something new in her expression. Not fear, but calculation. "He means to sell you, tomorrow or the next day. There's a trader coming through from New Orleans who specializes in difficult cases, men who cause problems." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Being sold wasn't just separation, it was erasure. Traders didn't ask questions or keep records beyond what was necessary for bills of sale. Men vanished into the Deep South's cotton fields or sugar plantations, their names forgotten, their connections severed. Some disappeared into places worse than that, places whispered about in the quarters after dark, where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. Where would he send me? Mississippi, probably the Delta region, or Louisiana. Eleanor's hands twisted the fabric of her skirt, the only outward sign of emotion. "Somewhere I'd never find you. Somewhere you'd work yourself to death in 2 seasons. Samuel set down the pruning shears before his shaking hands could betray him further. He'd known this moment would come eventually. They both had. What they'd built together, stolen hours in the conservatory, whispered conversations in the brief moments when Eleanor's social rounds brought her past the carpenter's shop where he worked, notes hidden in hollowed-out books in the library. All of it had been constructed on borrowed time. But knowing it would end and facing the actual ending were different things entirely. "Then we run," he said. "Tonight, before the trader comes." "Where?" Eleanor's question cut through his desperation like a knife. "How far would we get? A white woman and a black man traveling together? We'd be stopped by the first sheriff we encountered. You'd be hanged, and I'd be returned home in disgrace. If we're lucky." She was right. Samuel had known runaways, had hidden food for them, mended shoes, drawn maps of the swamp routes that might lead north. He'd also seen what happened when they were caught. The patrol system was efficient, motivated by bounties and the visceral fear that kept the whole system functioning. Running was suicide dressed up as hope. Then what? The question came out harsher than he'd intended. We just wait for him to tear us apart? Go quietly? No. Eleanor crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps, close enough that he could smell lavender water and the particular scent of her skin that had become more familiar to him than his own. Close enough to be dangerous if someone entered unexpectedly. "We make sure he can't." Samuel understood before she finished speaking. The knowledge arrived fully formed, bringing with it a cascade of implications that made his stomach turn. "Eleanor, don't say it's impossible. Don't tell me we can't." Her voice remained quiet, but intensity burned beneath the words. "I've spent 3 months thinking about this. 3 months examining every option, every possibility. This is the only way." "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about survival." She reached up and touched his face, a gesture so rare and reckless that it made his breath catch. "They'll hang you for being with me. You know that. The law says 6 months to 5 years, but the law doesn't matter when a planter's daughter is involved. They'll make an example. And they'll lock me away somewhere. An asylum, probably, where they put inconvenient women who refuse to be managed. We'll both be destroyed, just in different ways." Samuel caught her hand, pressed it against his cheek for one brief moment, before gently lowering it. They'd touched so rarely in 5 years. Every contact had been rationed, measured against the risk it represented. "How?" Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, and Samuel understood she'd been planning this for longer than 3 months. Probably since the first time they'd admitted what existed between them, 2 years ago in this same conservatory, when he'd been installing new heating pipes, and she'd brought him water on a day hot enough to make the glass walls feel like an oven. Arsenic, she said. Small doses over several weeks. Father's health has been declining. Everyone knows that. His stomach troubles, the weight loss, the weakness. Dr. Pemberton already suspects consumption. One more illness won't raise suspicions. Where would you get arsenic? The rat poison in the storage shed. It's bought in bulk. No one tracks how much is used. I've been taking small amounts for the past month, mixing it with clay and sugar to change the appearance. No one's noticed. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't a desperate plan formed in panic. This was premeditation. Eleanor had been preparing to kill her father for weeks, maybe months, and had only now chosen to tell him. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, he felt something closer to awe at the steel core beneath her careful social graces. Why tell me now? Because I need your help with what comes after. Eleanor moved to a small workbench where she kept her gardening tools and pulled aside a pot of ferns. Behind it was a wooden box, plain and unmarked. She opened it to reveal a leather pouch heavy with coins, a set of forged traveling papers, and 2 tickets for a steamboat to New Orleans. I've been saving money from my household allowance for 18 months, selling jewelry my mother left me. These papers identify you as James Morrison, a free man of color from Richmond. The tickets are for Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, traveling to New Orleans to visit family. Samuel stared at the contents of the box, his mind struggling to process the implications. Mrs. Morrison? We'll need a marriage certificate. I can forge one. I've been practicing my father's signature and Judge Crawford's. It won't hold up under serious scrutiny, but it doesn't need to. Just long enough to get us to New Orleans, then west to Texas or north to free territory. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she closed the box. But there's a problem. Just one? Despite everything, she almost smiled. We need proof. Something to show that what we had was real. That this wasn't just a mistress manipulating a slave or a slave seducing his master's daughter. Something that documents us as we actually are, not as they'll paint us in newspapers after. A photograph. Yes. Eleanor held his gaze. Before we do this, before everything changes, I want one moment captured as truth. Not their version. Ours. Samuel's mind raced through logistics, dangers, impossibilities. A photograph meant a photographer, which meant another person who could testify against them. It meant evidence that could survive them, proof of a crime that would haunt their memories even if they succeeded. It meant risking everything for sentiment. It also meant Eleanor understood that survival without testimony, without proof that they'd existed as people rather than property, was just another kind of death. When? He asked. April, after the spring planting, when Father's too busy to pay attention to my movements, when his illness has progressed enough that no one will question a sudden decline. Eleanor's voice dropped even lower. I've already done the calculations, the dosage, the timeline, how long we'll have after he dies before anyone starts asking difficult questions. We'll have maybe 48 hours, less if we're unlucky. And the photograph? There's a traveling photographer setting up in Mobile, Jay Whitmore. I've been watching his advertisements in the register. He moves around frequently, doesn't ask many questions. Perfect for what we need. Eleanor pulled a folded newspaper clipping from her pocket. He charges $2 for a sitting. I'll pay him $50 to forget we were ever there. Samuel took the clipping, though he barely read it. His mind had already accepted what they were planning, even as his conscience screamed against it. Murder, forgery, flight. Any one of those crimes could get them killed. Together they were either salvation or suicide, and he couldn't tell which. How do we do it? He asked, hating how calm his voice sounded. The actual how? Eleanor had thought about this too. Of course she had. His evening brandy. He drinks it at 8 o'clock every night, always the same amount. I'll serve it myself. He likes that, thinks it's charming that I play at being domestic. The arsenic dissolves completely, has almost no taste in alcohol. He'll complain of stomach pain, retire early. By morning he'll be too weak to leave his bed. In 3 days, maybe 4, his heart will give out. And you'll be there. Playing the grieving daughter. I'll be perfect. Something flickered across her face. Grief or guilt, or maybe just exhaustion. I've been practicing. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of what they were planning settling over them like a shroud. Somewhere outside, a bell rang, the noon signal that brought field hands in for their midday meal. Normal life, continuing as if the world wasn't about to fracture. We could still run, Samuel said quietly, though he knew it was useless. Take our chances. And die on the road, or get dragged back here for a very public execution. Eleanor shook her head. No. This is the only way we both survive. The only way we get proof we existed as something more than master and property. Samuel wanted to argue, to find another solution, to believe in a world where they didn't have to choose between murder and separation. But he'd lived in the South his entire life, had seen what happened to people who tried to exist outside the boundaries drawn by race and law. He knew Eleanor was right. Not morally, perhaps, but practically. They had no good choices, only terrible ones. When the time comes, he said slowly, when your father drinks that brandy, don't. Eleanor's interruption was sharp. Don't tell me you'll do it instead. Don't try to protect me from this. I made this choice. I'll carry it. I was going to say, Samuel continued, that I'll be the one they blame anyway. When it all comes out, and it will come out, Eleanor. Somehow it always does. They'll say I poisoned him, that I manipulated you, that I'm the monster. Then we'll make sure there's a photograph that tells the truth. Eleanor's jaw set with determination. Let them paint me as the victim afterward if they want. Let them rewrite the story however they need to sleep at night. But there will be one piece of evidence, one image, that shows exactly what we were to each other. Equals, partners, willing participants. The door to the conservatory opened suddenly, making them both freeze. Martha entered carrying a tea tray, her expression carefully blank in the way that meant she'd heard more than was safe for anyone. She was older than Eleanor by 15 years, had worked in the Fairmont household since before Eleanor was born, and had covered for these secret meetings more times than Samuel could count. Miss Eleanor, Martha said, her tone perfectly neutral. Your father is asking for you. Says he has something important to discuss. The color drained from Eleanor's face. Samuel saw her hand move unconsciously toward the box of forged papers and money, saw her catch herself before the gesture became too obvious. Thank you, Martha. Tell him I'll be there shortly. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but Samuel knew her well enough to hear the fear beneath. I was just inspecting the orchids with Samuel. One of them seems diseased. Martha set down the tea tray without looking directly at either of them. Yes, miss. The orchids. I'll let him know you'll be along. She paused at the door, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. You be careful now, Miss Eleanor. All sorts of things can go wrong with plants. Sometimes the roots are poisoned before you even notice the leaves starting to brown. Then she was gone, leaving silence and the heavy understanding that Martha knew exactly what they were planning, that she knew and had chosen to warn rather than expose them, that she, like them, was playing a dangerous game with impossibly high stakes. Eleanor moved quickly to hide the box of papers and money back behind the ferns. Her hands shook more noticeably now, the shock of Martha's warning breaking through her careful composure. I have to go. If I keep him waiting, I know. Samuel wanted to reach for her, to offer some comfort, but they'd already taken too many risks. Be careful. We're past careful. Eleanor straightened her dress, smoothing away wrinkles and composing her expression into something appropriate for a dutiful daughter. But I'll be cautious. We have 3 months, Samuel. 3 months to make this work. She left through the conservatory's main entrance, her footsteps fading as she walked toward the main house and whatever confrontation her father had planned. Samuel waited a full 5 minutes before leaving through the servants' entrance, pruning shears in hand, playing his role of groundskeeper perfectly. He didn't see Martha watching from a second-floor window, her expression troubled. Didn't know that Judge Crawford had indeed recommended sending Eleanor away, but had also suggested a much simpler solution, selling Samuel immediately, before the situation became more complicated than it already was. didn't know that Henry Fairmont, sitting in his study and waiting for his daughter, had already penned a letter to a slave trader in New Orleans. The trader was scheduled to arrive not tomorrow or the next day, but that evening. In 6 hours, Samuel would be in chains. The plan they'd spent 3 months building would collapse before it even began. And Eleanor Fairmont, walking toward her father's study with poison literally hidden in her rooms and metaphorically burning in her heart, was about to discover that sometimes murder isn't a choice at all. It's self-defense, Magnolia Heights Plantation. January 11th, 1857. Evening. Henry Fairmont sat in his study with the kind of stillness that came from 30 years of making decisions that destroyed lives. The room smelled of leather and cigar smoke, walls lined with books he'd never read but purchased because wealthy men were supposed to have libraries. On his desk sat a crystal decanter of brandy, a half-finished cigar, and a letter from New Orleans trader Marcus Hennessy confirming arrival by evening coach. He'd been expecting Eleanor for 20 minutes. Waiting was a tool he'd perfected. Let them stew, let their imagination fill with worst-case scenarios. Fear was more effective than anger, more lasting. The knock came soft and proper. "Father, you wanted to see me? Come in, Eleanor. Sit." She entered wearing a blue silk day dress, hair arranged carefully, hands folded. The perfect image of Southern womanhood. Henry had always been proud of how well she'd been trained, until 6 months ago, when Martha reported suspicious meetings in the conservatory. A father who didn't pay attention might have missed it. Henry Fairmont missed nothing. "I'll get straight to the point," he said, not offering her brandy or even basic courtesy. "I know about Samuel." Eleanor's face remained composed, but he saw the micro-flinch, the brief flutter of her eyelids that betrayed panic. Good. She wasn't as practiced at deception as she thought. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't insult my intelligence." Henry leaned forward. "Martha's been reporting your activities for months. The conservatory meetings, the whispered conversations, the way you look at him when you think no one's watching." He pulled a sheet of paper from his desk drawer. "I also found this in your room. Bills of sale for jewelry your mother left you. $1,500 total, sold over 18 months to 3 different merchants." Eleanor's composure finally cracked. "You searched my room, my house, my property, my daughter." He watched her process this, watched the calculations behind her eyes. "The money's gone, I assume. Hidden somewhere you thought was clever, along with forged papers and steamboat tickets, if my suspicions are correct." Silence. Eleanor's hands gripped the armrests of her chair, knuckles white. "Here's what's going to happen," Henry continued, his voice as calm as if discussing crop rotations. "Samuel will be sold tonight. There's a trader arriving from New Orleans within the hour. Specializes in difficult cases, runaways, troublemakers, enslaved who've gotten above their station. He'll take Samuel to Mississippi or Louisiana, somewhere so deep you'll never find him." "Father, please." "You'll write him a letter." Henry pulled out fresh paper and a pen, set them in front of her. "You'll explain that your relationship was a mistake brought on by loneliness and poor judgment. You'll tell him to forget you and accept his new life. You'll do this now, while I watch." Eleanor stared at the blank paper. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll have him whipped before the sale. 50 lashes in the quarters, in front of everyone, so they understand what happens when property forgets its place. Then I'll sell him anyway." Henry picked up his cigar, relit it with methodical patience. "Your choice. A letter that gives him some dignity, or public humiliation followed by the same result." He saw her mind working through options, probabilities, escape routes. She was smarter than most women. He'd always known that, had even taken some pride in it. But smart enough to outmaneuver him? Impossible. "How long have you known?" Eleanor's voice came out steady, controlled. "Long enough to confirm it with multiple witnesses. Long enough to make arrangements." Henry blew smoke toward the ceiling. "Did you really think you could hide it? Did you honestly believe that a white woman and a black man could conduct an affair in my household without anyone noticing?" "It wasn't an affair. We..." Eleanor caught herself. "You what?" Love each other? Henry laughed, the sound harsh in the book-lined room. Eleanor, I'm almost impressed. Almost. You managed to delude yourself into thinking this was something other than what it was. A slave seeing an opportunity and a foolish girl romanticizing what should have never been more than property performing duties. He's not property. He's... The slap came fast, sharp enough to snap Eleanor's head to the side. Henry stood slowly, looming over her. Don't. His voice dropped to something dangerous. Don't you dare say that in my house. He is property. He has always been property. And you have shamed yourself, shamed this family, and shamed your mother's memory by forgetting that fundamental truth. Eleanor's cheek bloomed red, but she didn't raise a hand to it. Just stared at him with something new in her expression. Not fear anymore, but calculation. Cold, focused calculation. Write the letter, Henry said, or I'll have Martha bring Samuel here, and you can watch what happens when masters lose patience with disobedient property. Eleanor picked up the pen. For a long moment she held it over the paper, and Henry thought he saw tears forming. Then she began writing in her careful, practiced script. What he didn't see, couldn't see from his position, was that she'd palmed a small envelope from her sleeve. Inside it, a carefully measured dose of arsenic mixed with sugar. What Henry also didn't know was that Eleanor had been planning for this conversation for weeks, had rehearsed every line, every reaction, every contingency. She wrote the letter slowly, deliberately, each word chosen to wound Samuel as little as possible while satisfying her father's expectations. When finished, she folded it and placed it on the desk. There. Are you satisfied? I'll be satisfied when Samuel is on that trader's wagon heading south. Henry picked up the letter, scanned it. Adequate. He'll receive this before departure. He returned to his chair, took a long pull from his brandy. You'll stay in your room for the next month. No visitors, no social calls. When we resume normal activities, you'll behave as if none of this happened. Judge Crawford has a nephew in Charleston, recently widowed, respectable family. You'll marry him by summer. I'll what? You'll marry him, produce children, and live the life expected of someone in your position. Henry finished his brandy, set the glass down with finality. This discussion is over. Martha will escort you to your room and remain there as your companion until I'm confident this madness has passed. Eleanor stood slowly, smoothing her dress. May I at least bring my things? My books, my sewing? Martha will bring what you need. Then may I have one last glass of brandy? Eleanor gestured to the decanter. To calm my nerves. I think I've earned that much. Henry studied her for a long moment, searching for deception, for tricks, for anything that might indicate she was planning something. He saw only a defeated young woman trying to maintain some dignity in the face of total loss. Exactly what he'd intended. One glass. Then Martha takes you upstairs. Eleanor moved to the sidebar where the brandy was kept, poured 2 glasses with hands that trembled just slightly. She brought one to her father, kept one for herself. The gesture was so ordinary, so perfectly daughterly, that Henry felt a brief pang of regret. She could have been an asset if she'd just followed the rules. Such a waste. To family duty, Henry said, raising his glass. To endings, Eleanor replied. They drank together. Henry noticed his brandy tasted slightly sweeter than usual. Eleanor must have added a bit from the sugar bowl to hers and splashed some into his from carrying both glasses. Women always liked their alcohol sweet. The dose Eleanor had added to his glass was carefully calculated. Not enough to kill him immediately. That would raise suspicion. But enough to begin the process. Combined with the small amounts she'd been adding to his evening brandy for the past 3 weeks, tonight's dose would push his system past the point of recovery. Go to your room, Henry said, waving his hand dismissively. I have correspondence to finish before Hennessy arrives. Eleanor curtsied, a gesture so submissive it almost made Henry smile, and left without another word. He watched her go, already turning his attention to the documents on his desk. The Samuel problem would be solved within 2 hours. The Eleanor problem would take a few months but was now manageable. Crisis averted. He didn't notice the faint burn in his stomach starting 20 minutes later. Didn't make the connection when the burn intensified to cramping. Only when he tried to stand an hour later and found his legs weak did he feel the first flicker of concern. By then, Eleanor was in her room with Martha, who'd been given very explicit instructions by Eleanor 3 days ago, along with $100 and a promise of freedom papers if she helped. Martha, who'd watched 3 generations of Fairmonts treat enslaved people like livestock, who'd seen her own daughter sold off when Henry needed quick cash, who'd spent 43 years building a reserve of quiet rage, made her choice. When Henry Fairmont collapsed at his desk, clutching his stomach and calling for help, Martha made sure to wait exactly 5 minutes before discovering him. 5 minutes that gave Eleanor time to retrieve the letter her father had forced her to write and replace it with a different one she'd written weeks ago, one that told Samuel exactly where to find the money and forged papers. By the time Dr. Pemberton arrived, Henry was vomiting blood and barely conscious. The doctor diagnosed acute gastritis brought on by bad shellfish. Fairmont had eaten oysters at the club 2 days prior. A reasonable explanation. No one thought to check if anyone else who'd eaten those oysters had gotten sick. Samuel, working in the carpenter's shop when word spread that Master Fairmont had taken ill, felt his hands start shaking so badly he had to set down his tools. He knew exactly what had happened, knew what it meant. The trader's coach arrived at 8 o'clock. By then, Henry Fairmont was delirious with pain, unable to confirm or deny any transactions. The trader, Marcus Hennessy, waited in the drawing room for an hour before Judge Crawford, who'd been summoned as both friend and legal counsel, told him there would be no sale tonight. Samuel stood in the quarters, the letter Eleanor had managed to slip to him pressed against his chest, and understood that 3 months of careful planning had just collapsed into 3 hours of desperate improvisation. At midnight, while Dr. Pemberton sat with the violently ill Henry Fairmont and debated whether to try bloodletting, Samuel stood at the servants' entrance to the main house. Martha opened the door, looked at him with eyes that held 43 years of witnessing horrors, and stepped aside. She's in her room, top of the stairs, 3rd door on the right. You have maybe 10 minutes before Dr. Pemberton checks on her. Why are you helping us? Because I'm tired. Martha's voice was flat, empty. Tired of watching people like you and her get destroyed for the crime of being human. Now go. Clock's running. Samuel climbed the stairs, found Eleanor's door, knocked 3 times. She opened it wearing a traveling dress, her hair pinned up, a leather satchel already packed. Behind her, the window stood open, rope made from knotted bed sheets dangling into the darkness. He's dying. Samuel's question wasn't really a question. By morning, yes. Maybe sooner. Eleanor's voice was steady, clinical. We have to leave now. The forged papers and money are in the satchel. Martha's arranged for 2 horses to be waiting at the crossroads. We ride to Mobile, catch the first steamboat out. I don't care where it's going as long as it's away. Eleanor, Samuel caught her hand. This makes us murderers. No, she held his gaze. This makes us survivors. There's a difference. From downstairs came the sound of raised voices, Dr. Pemberton calling for more water, Crawford asking questions about what Fairmont had eaten. Crisis sounds that would keep everyone's attention for precious minutes. We can still turn back, Samuel said, even as he helped her lift the satchel. Confess. Face whatever comes. They'll hang you and lock me in an asylum. That's what comes. Eleanor moved to the window, tested the rope. I chose this. Weeks ago, when I realized we had no other options. I chose you over him, freedom over duty, truth over their laws. Now you have to choose. Are you coming with me or not? Samuel looked at the woman who'd poisoned her own father for him, saw the desperation and determination in equal measure, understood that she'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, that she'd staked everything on them having a chance. I'm coming. They went out the window together, climbed down the improvised rope in the Alabama darkness. Behind them, Henry Fairmont convulsed in his study while a doctor tried treatments that would never work. Ahead of them, 2 horses waited at a crossroads, and beyond that, a photographer's wagon in Mobile, where they'd capture one moment of truth before everything fell apart. Samuel and Eleanor ran hand in hand through the January night, fugitives before the crime was even officially discovered. They had stolen horses, forged papers, and poison in their past. What they didn't have yet, what wouldn't come for 3 more months, was the photograph that would turn them from forgotten criminals into a historical mystery. They reached the crossroads breathless and terrified, mounted the waiting horses, and as they spurred toward Mobile, behind them at Magnolia Heights Plantation, Henry Fairmont took his last shuddering breath. His final thought was confusion. He'd been so careful, so in control. How had it come to this? He never realized that control was always an illusion, that the daughter he'd tried to cage and the slave he'd tried to sell had been planning his end for months, that the system he'd built his fortune on had created its own destroyers. Dawn found Samuel and Eleanor 30 miles south, riding hard toward Mobile, and a photographer who didn't yet know he was about to become part of murder evidence that would survive 146 years. Alabama Department of Archives and History, Montgomery, Alabama, March 15, 2003. Marcus Webb had been staring at the photograph for 6 hours straight. His coffee had gone cold twice. His advisor had called 3 times, increasingly irritated that he'd missed their scheduled meeting. The reading room closed in 45 minutes, and he still couldn't look away from the daguerreotype labeled 1951 to 847. A white woman and a black man sitting together in 1857, touching, present, undeniably intimate. The kind of photograph that shouldn't exist. He'd already pulled Henry Fairmont's death certificate from the Baldwin County records. Gastric fever, complications from shellfish poisoning, July 19, 1857. Doctor's signature illegible, cause of death unquestioned. Marcus had found the notice in the mobile register announcing Fairmont's sudden passing, survived by his daughter Eleanor, services private. He'd found the estate inventory filed 3 weeks later, listing 347 enslaved people, 3 plantations, and noting that Eleanor Fairmont had departed for extended mourning in Virginia with relatives. Standard protocol for a grieving daughter. Except Eleanor Fairmont had no relatives in Virginia. Marcus had checked, twice. The aunt mentioned in one newspaper item didn't exist in any census records, marriage registers, or property deeds. Eleanor Fairmont had vanished from Alabama in July 1857 and never appeared in any official documents again. No marriage certificate, no death record, no will, nothing. And Samuel, the enslaved man Henry Fairmont had been planning to sell, had disappeared the exact same night Fairmont died. Marcus pulled out his legal pad, the one he'd been filling with notes since Tuesday. The timeline made sense if you were willing to believe something extraordinary. January 11th, 1857. Henry Fairmont consumed arsenic-laced brandy. January 11th. July 19th, 1857. Slow poisoning over 6 months. July 19th, 1857. Henry Fairmont died. July 19th, 1857. Eleanor and Samuel fled April 14th, 1857. This photograph was taken. Wait. Marcus rechecked his notes. April came before July. The photograph predated the death by 3 months, which meant when Eleanor and Samuel sat for this portrait, Henry Fairmont was already poisoned but not yet dead. They'd commissioned evidence of their relationship while actively murdering her father. The audacity of it made Marcus's hands shake. He turned his attention to the photographer's mark embossed on the leather case, J. Whitmore, Traveling Portraits. Marcus had spent 2 days tracking Whitmore through newspaper advertisements. The photographer had appeared in Mobile on March 23, 1857, advertising daguerreotype portraits of exceptional quality, discretion assured. He'd placed ads through April 17th, then vanished completely. No forwarding address, no subsequent advertisements in any Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana papers. Just gone. Like he'd known to disappear before questions started being asked. Marcus pulled out the Mobile register from April 21st, 1857. Buried on page 6, a tiny notice. The photographer J. Whitmore has departed the city unexpectedly, leaving debts at Mrs. Harrison's boarding house and McKinley's mercantile unpaid. Those with claims should contact. Disappeared within days of taking this photograph. Professional or panicked? Marcus couldn't tell, but the timing reeked of someone who understood they'd witnessed something dangerous. He carefully opened the leather case again, examining the daguerreotype under the magnifying glass he'd borrowed from the conservator. The image quality was extraordinary. Whitmore had been skilled. Eleanor sat on a bench, wearing dark silk with ivory buttons. Samuel stood behind her, his right hand resting on her shoulder, their fingers intertwined. Both faced slightly toward each other rather than the camera, creating an intimacy that survived 146 years. But it was their expressions that gutted Marcus every time he looked. Eleanor's face showed something beyond love, a desperate, defiant determination, like someone documenting proof before an execution. Samuel's expression mixed tenderness with the exhausted wariness of a man who'd spent his entire life navigating impossible situations. Together, they looked like people who'd already chosen their fate and were simply waiting for it to arrive. Marcus checked his watch. 30 minutes until closing. He pulled up the newspaper archives on the library's microfilm reader, searching for anything about Fairmont's death beyond the obituary. Founded on July 23, 1857. Inquiry into Planter's death. Authorities in Baldwin County have opened an inquiry into the death of Henry Fairmont, prominent planter, who expired July 19th after prolonged illness. Of particular interest is the disappearance of Fairmont's daughter Eleanor and the Negro Samuel, Fairmont's property, both of whom vanished the night of Fairmont's death. Judge Thaddeus Crawford, executor of the Fairmont estate, has offered $500 reward for information leading to their capture. The pair are believed to have fled toward Mobile, possibly intending to board a steamboat north. Sheriff's deputies and slave patrols have been notified throughout Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Marcus's stomach tightened. They'd made it to Mobile. That's where the photograph was taken, which meant they'd been fugitives carrying murder evidence while sitting for a portrait that could identify them. The calculation was insane. Unless the photograph wasn't evidence of their crime, it was evidence of their humanity. Proof that before the law turned them into murderous and runaway property, they'd been two people who loved each other enough to kill and die for that love. He kept searching, found an update dated August 14, 1857. Reward increased. Judge Crawford has increased the reward for Eleanor Fairmont and the runaway Negro Samuel to $1,000 for information leading to their capture. Reports placed the fugitives on a steamboat departing Mobile for New Orleans in mid-July, though subsequent searches of New Orleans have yielded no results. Authorities speculate the pair may have continued west to Texas or attempted to reach free territory in the north. The inquiry into Henry Fairmont's death continues, with Dr. Pemberton testifying that Fairmont's symptoms were consistent with acute gastric poisoning, though the source remains unidentified. So they'd made it to New Orleans. After that, the trail went cold. Marcus searched through months of newspaper archives, August, September, October 1857. Nothing. The story simply stopped. Two people accused of murder and flight, carrying forged papers and a photograph that could damn them, vanished into American history like smoke. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The reading room's fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Around him, other researchers packed up their materials, filing out toward normal lives that didn't include obsessing over 146-year-old mysteries. He should leave too. Come back tomorrow with fresh eyes. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called his advisor, Dr. Patricia Morrison. Marcus, you missed our meeting. I know, I'm sorry, but I need to talk to you about something I found. It's 6 o'clock. I'm making dinner. This is important. I found a photograph, a daguerreotype from 1857. It shows a white woman and an enslaved black man sitting together, touching each other, clearly intimate. Dr. Morrison, I think I'm looking at evidence of a murder. Silence